And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our midweek Bible study. It is Monday, November the 15th. Hope you're having a good day. I am Mike Carey. I'm the pastor of the First United Methodist Church of Nevada, Iowa. We are working our way 2 times a week through the Gospel according to Luke, and we are up today to chapter 4 and starting at verse 16 through 30. So if you're following along, and I hope you are, that's where you should be turning at this particular point in time. And we will begin. Chapter 4, verse 16 through 30. So Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as was his habit, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read the lesson. Now, the roll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He opened the roll and found the passage where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring the good news to the poor. He has sent me to announce release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who have been bruised, to proclaim that the year which everyone is waiting for has come." And he folded up the roll and handed it back to the officer and sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed intently on him. And he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your ears." And all witnessed to him and were amazed at the words of grace that came from his mouth. And they said, "Is this not the son of Joseph?" He said to them, "You are bound to quote the proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. We have heard about all that has happened in Capernaum. Do the same kinds of things here in your own home country." And he said, "This is the truth that I tell you. No prophet is accepted in his own home country. In truth, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and when there was a great famine over all the earth. And to none of them was Elijah sent, but he was sent to Zarephath, to the widow of Sidon. And there were many lepers in Israel in the times of Elisha the prophet, and none of them were healed, but Naaman the Syrian was. And the people in the synagogue were filled with anger as they listened to these things. And they rose up and hustled him out of the town. They took him to throw him to the brow of a hill on which their town is built, to throw him down. But he passed through the midst of them and went upon his way. So that is our reading now from Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 30. So Nazareth was not a village. We need to understand that right now. It was a polis, as was referred to in the language, which meant a city or a town. There could have been, most of the towns in the area of Galilee were fairly well populated, and Nazareth could have been a town of about 20,000, which in those days was a very, very significant community. It stood in the little hollow of the hills on the lower slopes of Galilee, near what's called the plain of Jezreel. If you go back into your Old Testament, or if you want to Google the plains of Jezreel, you'll find out that a lot of Old Testament stuff happened in that neck of the woods. And so there's just an amazing panorama from the hills surrounding Nazareth. You can see a lot, and it's very inspiring. And so, in fact, you can see a whole lot of Israel's history from there. You have the plains of Eshkelon, where Deborah and Baruch fought. They're two of the judges of the Old Testament. You can see where Saul crashed in his final campaign against the Philistines and met disaster. You can see where King Josiah was also killed in battle against the Egyptians. And you can also see Naboth's vineyard, which is the story there with David and Naboth. And there's just a whole lot of Israel's history that centers around that particular part of the country. And you can, from the heights, you can even see in the distance the blue of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's a lovely area, a very picturesque area, a very historical area for Israel. And There are three great roads that go through that particular area. There's the Great Way to the Sea, which goes from Damascus to Egypt. In fact, this whole area is what's called a land bridge. The roads that run east, the Silk routes, run from there. And you have also then the land bridge roads that runs from Damascus down to Egypt and is the gateway into Africa. And then you also have the roads that lead up then into Turkey and eventually to the Straits of the Dardanelles over into Greece and into Europe. And so it's literally the crossroads of that half of the world. And so it is a strategically, it's very, very important. It's a very important area, which is why you had so many battles that would be fought there in the plains of Jezreel, for example, simply because back then you needed wide open spaces to be able to fight a battle with armies, but also it just was a strategically important area. If you wanted to get from point A to point B or from point B to point C, you had to control this area. You had to hold it. And so that's why so much of history hinges on this particular area. You may think Israel, really, when you get down into the nuts and bolts of history, is a minor player and is kind of off the beaten track, but it is close enough to this strategic area where you have the great roads of the ancient world running that a whole bunch of history flows through here. And that's why you have the Assyrians early in Israel's history coming in and causing them pain. And then later on the Babylonians, and there was always intrigue with Egypt and eventually Greece as Greece became an ascending power, and Rome eventually. It was important to control this particular area and these great roads that have existed for eons. And so this is the area then where Jesus was raised. Nazareth is close to that particular area. Now, the passage in question, we have Jesus now going to, it says, as was his custom, he went to the Sabbath on synagogue. Jesus on Sabbath was in the synagogue, if at all possible. That was his habit. I think that would say something to you and I as well. On our Sabbath, it is important for us to be in a house of worship. We should be worshiping. If that was a good enough habit for Jesus to involve himself in, well, then I think maybe it's also a habit that's good enough for you and I to indulge ourselves in as well. Now, back then, even in a synagogue, in a large Jewish community, which means it would be prosperous, to say the least, and might have even had been able to afford a resident teacher, a resident rabbi. We don't know. There was not a professional line of what we would call pastors, ministers. They called them rabbis that were resident in one particular synagogue. The synagogues were basically laity run. There would be a president of the synagogue. There would be a person who would be in charge of the rolls where the scriptures were kept and written. Remember, back then they did not have books. The scriptures would be written on rolls, parchment rolls, which would be rolled up and would be handled with great care. Because you wouldn't dare touch the scripture with dirty hands, for example, because you don't want to fingerprint up the parchment and make it harder to read, because it took a great deal of time and it cost very, very much to obtain a roll of the scriptures of the entire Hebrew Old Testament. So during the service, there would be prayers and there would be reading of several different verses, at least 7 different portions of the Hebrew Bible. Remember, it's Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And different people would do the reading. Now, when it comes now to the prophet, Jesus himself, did he volunteer to do the reading? Or was he asked to do the reading? We don't really know. We just know that he did. And it's from the book of Isaiah. And he's talking, and it was not unusual then for that person, or a person who was a visiting dignitary, somebody from out of town, maybe a priest or something like that who happened to be there, they would be asked to make some remarks, our idea of a sermon. Only not a whole lot of time for preparation. It would be basically stand up, open your mouth, and hope that you don't fill it with your foot. And so, but they were looking at Jesus with a great deal of excitement and expectation, because Jesus had already at this point started his ministry, and there were things that were going on. That's why he makes the reference there to you've heard all that happened in Capernaum, and you're saying now, well, do the same things here in Nazareth. Well, what things are they talking about? Well, we don't know for sure, but we know that Jesus has already started his public ministry. Did that involve miracles and healings and things like that? Possibly. Certainly, he's been teaching as he has gone along. Does he have disciples at this point in time? We're not sure. We just know that early in his ministry, he went home. And I can tell you from experience that, a prophet does not have honor in his home country. Why is that? Well, it's because people look at you and they don't see you as a person who's called. They see you as, hey, I remember you. You're so-and-so's kid, and you used to do this and that, and, I remember you growing up, and who do you think you are now? Something special? Someone special? Well, yeah, I'm called, I'm ordained. I've spent 40 days, 40 nights in the wilderness here, and I'm starting to do ministry, and I'm have a gathering here, a following. So, but then he makes that comment. He's reading from Isaiah 61, and verse 20 is part of that reading. And he's saying now, this day, this reading, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. Wow. That's interesting. It says he sat down before he made those comments. That's what a rabbi did. After the reading of the scripture, you stood for the reading of the scripture, and then the rabbi sat down when he taught. It says Jesus sat down. So he's assuming the position of a rabbi at that point. Now, whether or not his hometown recognized him as such, probably not, judging by their reaction to him. And when he says what he says, people didn't like it because, amongst other things here, he's paying a compliment to the Gentiles. He talks about how, let's just go back and look at that for a second. Many of the were the lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha. None of them was healed, but Naaman the Syrian. Oh, it's not just Gentiles, it's a Syrian. The Syrians, eventually to become Assyria, were hated passionately. That was a racial thing between the Jews and the Syrians at that point. And for Jesus to pay a compliment to Naaman, it doesn't matter that it's right there in their scripture, in their story. I mean, we can go back into the scripture, we can read that story for ourselves, that Naaman, the general of the Syrian army, which was dominant in the area at that point in time, when the Jewish king was told that Naaman was coming there, he had leprosy, and he had instructions to be healed, the king threw a fit. Says, why is Syria trying to pick a fight with me? I can't heal him. Doesn't matter what they want. And so, but Jesus here is saying, he basically he's paying a compliment to the Gentiles. Well, that's not going to sit well with people. And so the whole idea that he's saying that the Gentiles somehow have some sort of favor over the Jews with God, whoa, that irritated people. I remember I shouldn't even tell you this, but the first sermon I preached in outside of a classroom setting was in my home church back in Central Ohio. The pastor was on vacation, and I was asked if I would come back and preach 2 Sundays, and I agreed to. But I said some things that I look back on it now, and I wonder, why in the world did I say that? It was 2 horrible sermons, just terrible. But they were what they were. But the church, on the first Sunday I was there, the church was full. People came with expectations. It's a little country church, wasn't that big of a crowd. but still, for that church, it was pretty full. Not so much the second Sunday, which gives you an idea as what the first Sunday had to be like. But it's not only that the prophet doesn't have honor because people think of you as the kid back then, but also the people from when you were growing up too, and things that maybe as a pastor you would not know, and you hold grudges, for example, that you wouldn't hold as being a pastor in an area, and so. And that was certainly the case going back to my hometown, home church. But be that as it may, Jesus was not met kindly in his hometown, primarily because of what he said, how he said it, and the way people took it. And they thought, oh boy, he's getting uppity on us here now, and heretical, complimenting the Gentiles. And so, bang, there you go. But the one thing you got to notice about this sermon that he gives, this is a difference between Jesus and John the Baptist here. John was a preacher of doom and gloom, of judgment. Get yourself right because the end is coming and will be here soon. This is the gospel here. This is the word of hope. And even though people here say, isn't this the son of Joseph, the carpenter, and now he's coming in as an itinerant rabbi? What's the deal here? You look at his words carefully. These are words of hope. This is the gospel. This day, this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing. What did he mean by that? He's saying, I am the fulfillment of that prophecy. They didn't like that either. This is the first reaction. Of course, he didn't do any miracles or signs of power at this time in his hometown. So people didn't have anything to really place this in context with. They just had what he was saying and knowing who he was from the past. And so there you go. They didn't like it. They didn't like it much. They wanted to throw him off the hillside there. Now, some people say that was a steep cliff and that they really meant to do him serious harm. I don't know if that's the case so much. Throw him off the hill as in throwing him out of town, perhaps. But the fact is that he passed through them, and the other writers say no one was able to lay a hand on him. Now, is that a miracle in that he exerted his authority and his power and his influence enough that people backed off and they just let him go? Did he say something? Well, we're not told what he said. We just simply know that while they had an intention to do something nasty to him, they weren't able to do it. Which, to me, I think he exerted his power and his authority because, as he would say later on, it's not my time yet. But that also goes to show that at any given time, in any given situation, especially in his passion leading up to the cross, when Jesus was abused so horribly and eventually crucified, he did not have to let that happen. He could have at any time exerted his power and authority, and he could have stopped all of that. He could have. He did it on several occasions during his 3-year ministry. No one could lay a hand on him. And it wasn't because he just was too slick, going from one town to the next to the next. It's just that he simply would not allow it to happen because his time had not yet come. So Jesus, we need to remember, loved us so much that he was willing to go to the cross. He went to the cross. He went willingly. He did not have to. He could have prevented it. Some people, great scholars, Albert Schweitzer being one of them, say that Jesus was basically a martyr who threw himself on the great gears of time and culture and was crushed by them. He was not successful. Quite the opposite. Jesus threw himself upon the cross to accomplish the purposes of our salvation, and he was successful. And he was successful because he was willing and able to allow that to happen, but to hold off. It's one thing to use authority to keep people from doing stuff to you. It's another thing to not use your authority when you can to allow people to do things to you. One of the cruelest temptations of Jesus' passion, I think, was when the crowd was gathering around the cross and they were yelling, "Come down from the cross and we will believe." And was that a temptation? Absolutely it was, because Jesus could have come down from the cross. He could have said at any time, "No, not going to do this. You people are not worth this. I'm going to put a stop to this right now." He could have come down from the cross. And when you have the ability to do something but you know you should not, and you do not for the welfare of others, that's real strength. That's real power. Power is not exerting your might and your influence. It's knowing when not to and holding back. So that takes us up now to chapter 4, verses 31 through 37, which is the spirit, the unclean spirit, that Jesus will deal with in Capernaum. He leaves Nazareth now, and we get into one of the first miracle accounts that Luke will give to us, and we'll pick that up next time. We're up to our 20 minutes here, 21 minutes actually, so we'll pick that up on Wednesday. It'll be Luke chapter 4, starting at verse 31, 37, and I hope you stop by and join me then. In the meantime, hope the Lord blesses you real good.